Hi everyone, welcome back to Mad About Cards and Crafts. Today I'm sharing this vintage inspired floral card featuring the beautiful massive peony from Gina K Designs. I have had this in my collection for quite some time and have not used it. So I'm also using the water droplet stencil and Gina K Designs champagne embossing powder and my Karin Waterbrush markers. I am going to be doing some heat embossing, so I'm stamping with Versamark ink onto a piece of Fabriano Coldpress watercolor paper. I will have the watercolor paper linked in the description box below. The panel is cut roughly to 8.5 by 3.5, I'm sorry, but I am going to end up cutting this panel down shortly. As you could see on the back side, I did try to stamp and emboss this with white embossing powder, and I just was struggling with seeing the difference between the leaves and the peony petals. So I switched it up, turned my card panel over, and went with the champagne embossing powder. The champagne embossing powder is no longer available in the Gina K Designs store, but a gold embossing powder would work just as beautifully. I'm going to use the acetate from that peony, and I'm going to lay the color down from my Karin markers. I started with a red lilac, and that's what I'm going to initially add to this floral. So I've put some water down and I'm going to drop in that color. I made sure that I wasn't too flooded with water, but I had enough on there that I was going to get a little bit of movement. This is a super easy technique. One of the nice things about watercoloring with an embossing powder is that it kind of works as a well. So unless you add way too much water, it's not going to flow over into other areas. So it's easy to keep the peony separate from the leaves. When I add the color, I add it to the base of the petal where the petals are meeting, so the inside of the peony. And then there's going to be a little bit higher concentration where all of the leaves bunch up in the center, so I'll add a little bit there as well. I always clean off my brush. So you see I lay the color down, then I wash that pigment off of my brush and bring in some more clear water on my watercolor brush to spread it out, and that's going to give it that lighter look. This is a beautiful color, the lilac that I used, but I am going to mix it up because I did want to add a little bit more depth. One of the nice things about the Karin markers is that they are highly pigmented. It's actually an ink and not a watercolor. And I find that for me personally, using the Fabriano paper is what works best for me. I've had a real struggle using it on less expensive watercolor paper. This technique, you could use it with the Altenew watercolors. You could use it with the, oh my goodness, the Primo watercolors. You don't have to use an expensive watercolor or watercolor pen with this. The technique works with any type of watercolors, and if you're afraid of using watercolors, I would suggest you try heat embossing your image first. That really does help with the control. I started with the apple, which was the lighter green, and I colored the entire leaf with that. Next, I brought in an Arctic blue and I dropped that into the base of those smaller leaves, and I'm using that same Arctic blue on my large leaves. So you can see I'm not painting the entire leaf. I'm just dropping in a little bit of color, cleaning off my brush, and then I use that clean water to spread it out. Where I find that I need more concentration, obviously, as I said, my shadows are going to be where leaves meet, where petals overlap the leaves. That's where I'm going to add my darkest colors. And so I'm just adding that extra bit of shading in. And then we're going to move over to the little flowers, which are what I'm considering like violets. So I'm going to add the pale violet, which was the first color that you saw me lay down, onto those violets right there. So I've added some water to the violets, and again, I'm just dropping in the color. So as I was saying, I would really highly recommend, if you're afraid of this, just get some inexpensive watercolors, do a little bit of heat embossing, get some Canson watercolor paper. It doesn't hold the water. Canson doesn't hold the water as well as some of the more expensive brands. So make sure that you don't overwater, and that's going to take a little bit of practice. So when you're laying down that initial wash of water, don't use too much water, because the Canson paper for some reason just doesn't hold that water the same way that some of the other watercolor papers do. I wanted to add a little bit more depth and a little bit more green to those larger leaves. So I'm bringing in a teal. It's called Ocean Teal, and I'm adding that. And once I get it placed where I want that, I'm going to bring in a little bit more of that Arctic blue. And again, that's just adding more texture, more interest, more depth to my composition. Layer, layer, layer. That is the biggest tip I can give you. Besides not adding too much water. Do lots of layering. If you think that something isn't working, just keep adding different layers and different colors, and a lot of times it will really work out. For that pink peony, I think it's absolutely beautiful. I love that color, but I tend to lean more towards pinks, and I wanted to try something a little bit different. So now I'm going to drop in some of that pale lilac in just a few moments once I finish up these little lilacs. I am going to add that pale blue again to those lilacs, so you see that they have a beautiful purple color, but I do want to add a little bit more depth to those as well, so I will bring in the Arctic to those. Here's where I'm dropping in that purple to give the peony a different look. I feel like I lose some of the pink with this, so I'm going to come back in a second time with that red lilac just to get a little bit more depth of that pink back into my flower. And you can see the vibrancy of those watercolors and how well they all blend and work together. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I would absolutely love for you to subscribe and ring the bell so that you're notified whenever I do upload a video. I do list all of the supplies that I have used in the description box below, so you'll be able to find any of these supplies if you're interested. I do use affiliate links. I want to thank you so much for using those affiliate links. It really does help me to continue bringing fresh content to my channel. I'm going to turn this around, and I'm going to start on my second peony. For that second peony, I'm going to color it the same way but with different colors. So I didn't want both of my peonies to be the exact same. I'm starting with the pale violet, and I added that wash of watercolor, and now I'm dropping in that pale violet. I don't show the coloring of the leaves and other florals because I pretty much colored them the same. I'm going to add a little bit more pink to this, so I'm adding a pale pink, which kind of has like a rose tint to it. And once I put that color down, I will come back in with the pale violet again and deepen some of the purple. And you'll see that I get a really nice purplish pink rose or peony. I love all the florals over in the Gina K Designs shop. There are some fabulous designers over there. Hannah, I believe, is the one who illustrated this large peony. I am going to link her Instagram channel. She is such a joy to watch, so transparent and just incredibly talented. So I would highly recommend, if you're on Instagram, that you follow her account and just watch the wonderful posts that she creates using the illustrations that she does that aren't necessarily going to be turned into stamp sets, but she colors jeans and is just such a talent and such a joy. Here I added some water to my background. I wanted to drop in some of that blue just to lighten up the background. I didn't want the whiteness of the paper, so I added a little bit of that Arctic blue very lightly to the background, I should say. These are my Gonzai Tombi Starry pans. I will list the gold that I used for this splattering in the description box below. I added some water to the pan, mixed it up, and then I added it to my brush. If I didn't mention this, I use my Ranger heat tool to do my drying because it's not going to melt my embossing powder, and it spreads the heat much more evenly so I don't get a lot of warping. Here I'm using my Arteza white gouache and adding a few more splatters. Now we are going to antique this panel. The panel was beautiful. I would use that panel by itself, but I was going for a different look this time. So I'm adding some vintage photo around the edges of my panel, and I'm going to cut this down to 8 1/4 by 3 1/4 using my Tim Holtz Distress Guillotine trimmer. If you haven't seen this trimmer, it is fantastic. It gives you just a nice little deckled edge to the edges. There's a different pattern at the top of the arm as there is at the bottom of the arm, so you can get smaller and larger cuts from that. I wanted to add quickly just a little bit of color, so I swiped my Distress Oxide, again in vintage photo, across my panel, and now I'm doing a little bit of ink blending. Gina K Designs recently just came out with some blending brushes. I don't have them. I will link hers in the description box below. I have heard that they are fabulous, so check them out. This is her water droplet stencil. I'm using some Imagine Craft spray in Frost. Look at how beautiful that turns out, and I simply sprayed it on top of the stencil and then let it dry. Here I'm adding some black soots to those deckled edges. I'm doing a very small border. I'm not overpowering this piece. I will add a heavier layer to, I start out light right here, but I'm going to add a heavier layer to this water droplets panel. The water droplets panel is cut to 3 1/2 by 8 1/2, which is what that craft card base is. That's Nina Desert Storm cardstock, and I'm going to glue the water droplets directly to that panel. I've added some foam tape to my floral, and these are from Tim Holtz. These are his new, they're tall letters, which I absolutely love. There is a triple layer, so I used some gold cardstock and then 2 layers of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I cut out the letters and I layered them together. I have a sentiment from the Greetery, and I'm going to cover up the word happy. Use my Versamark ink, remove the tape that was covering that happy, and stamp that out. I used the same champagne embossing powder, and now I'm using some vintage photo on the piece that I did cut down using a Tim Holtz guillotine trimmer. I added some foam tape to the back of this, and now I'm going to try to decide where I want this birthday placed. I'm not going to push it down because I don't know if I like it there. I'm going to move it a couple more times, decide on a spot, and that's going to be my card for today. Here's a look at my finished card. I'll show you a second look which shows you the layering. I want to thank you so much for stopping by today, and I hope you have a fabulous day. Thanks again for watching.